This is your friendly neighborhood author, Jonathan, and you are listening to Season 4 of the Floor Rejects podcast, The Wells House Phenomenon.
Oh, I forgot my remote today. Hey, welcome back. We're here. You know why we're here. For a new chapter of The Wells House Phenomenon. Chapter 17 this week. If you don't remember what happened last week, that was a week in which we were kind of just following Warren mostly through his dream. He was kind of confused and going to look for Thomas, and he had spent a fair bit of time not seeing him, and he went out into the forest to that little meeting spot where he had kind of found him that first day, and he ended up finding him, and they chat. They go a little bit more into depth about Thomas's, I guess, family history, and Warren learns even more about what he's up against, and we find out he's up against a lot. In the end of the chapter is Thomas kind of being like, I need to be back near you. It's just part of this. I can't be too far away from you for too long, or my existence just sort of starts to fade. And Warren, in a strange little fit, just doesn't really say anything to Thomas and starts rubbing leaves on his arms. And that's where the chapter cuts out. He's got this like half-cocked idea of how he's going to get Thomas back into the house and how he's going to get him back in there, not only safely, but in a way that, doesn't end up with him being abused even further. So without further ado, and without me toying with my hair anymore, because it's just going to look the way it is on camera, why don't we get into chapter 17 of the Wells House Phenomenon, and then we'll come back, have a fun little discussion about it, and maybe talk about some things in this chapter that, as I was rereading it and trying to revise a little bit on the fly, I kind of felt like I enjoyed. So, yeah, I guess that's it. Let's see if this works this time. It did not work. Okay, let's try again. Chapter 17. Plan Enacted. Warren woke up alone, his bedding still scattered about the room around him. He smiles, remembering the night before, the feeling of Edward's huge body against him. When he saunters into the kitchen, he has a swagger to his step. Lila turns from the stove as a floorboard creaks under his foot.
Good morning, Warren. Sit. Have breakfast. Edward should be coming down in a few minutes,
she says, setting his customary black coffee in front of him. He grins down into the cup, flaring his legs out under the table, feeling a sense of power he had almost forgotten. Lila hands down his breakfast from the prep table, and he looks up to grab the salt. He catches sight of Edward, who shoots him a knowing glance before he greets his mother. He sits next to Warren, nudging him flirtatiously. Warren grabs a fork and starts to shovel the food into his mouth, but pauses as a sharp pain runs up his left forearm. He looks down and drops the utensil in horror as he spots a rash rising quickly to his skin surface, materializing before his very eyes. Anxiety runs through his chest. He looks to his other forearm to see the same spots bubbling up, looking wet and raw. Edward glances down and recoils.
"Is that poison oak?"
he asks incredulously, and Warren looks up at him in panic.
I have no idea. I haven't been anywhere near it.
Warren can hear his voice rising in anxiety.
Wash your hands, Warren. You don't want it to spread,
Lila says, rushing over. Warren leaps up and runs to the sink, washing his hands thoroughly, then lets the cool water run over his now burning skin.
I have no idea where this came from. I don't think I've been anywhere but the front gate for days,
Warren says over his shoulder from the sink. His skin was on fire, the rash developing to the point that his arm was completely red and yellow. He yelps, the cold water now causing him even more pain. He hadn't had poison oak since he was a little kid. He'd always been keen on avoiding it when he was outdoors since then. He can't figure out how it was all over his arms and hands, but nowhere else. Edward? Warren says quietly, the larger man drawing close as Warren pulls a wet paper towel over each of his forearms.
Do you have a rash anywhere?
He asks under his breath, hoping Lila won't hear him. Edward shakes his head. He tells Warren he isn't allergic to it.
I have to go to town. If it gets much worse, I might need to go to the hospital.
Warren says, remembering how badly he'd reacted when he'd trampled a vine when he was 6 and ended up caked in calamine lotion and out of school for a week.
No.
Lila shouts uncharacteristically, her chair clattering to the floor as she stands abruptly. Warren turns to her, confused.
I just mean, you don't need to do that. I know a recipe to calm that rash down.
She says.
Lila, it's fine. I'll grab some calamine and maybe go visit Thomas.
Warren says. Lila's nails dig into the table's surface, squeaking as Edward rushes to her.
I think you should try my mom's concoction. She's really good at this sort of thing.
Edward says. Warren shoots him a confused look at the nickname in front of Lila. Lila nods furiously. As Warren weighs his options, he feels a dull flush at the base of his neck. He has a vague thought of still seeing Thomas. He has an intense moment of deja vu, making his eyes lose focus and his balance slip. He grabs the lip of the sink to steady himself.
I really think I'll just go get it. I know how I react to this stuff. Plus, I really want to check on Thomas.
Warren says. Edward leans down and whispers something to his mother, and Warren is unnerved when Lila nods and shuffles from the room without another word. Edward crosses the room in 3 steps and wraps Warren up in a tight embrace.
Warren, please. My mother is a caretaker. It's what she does. She's good at it, and you don't need to visit Thomas. You know how he is.
Edward says. At the sound of Edward's brother's name, Warren again feels the hot flush of an unclear memory.
I appreciate that, but I can't explain it. I just feel like I need to visit Thomas. I feel awful that he's been all alone.
Warren says. Edward's arms tighten.
You don't need to, Warren. I actually heard from him today, and he's going to be home tomorrow. Will you please let her take care of you? Maybe let me take care of some other itches you can't quite scratch on your own?
Edward asks, wiggling Warren in his arms. Warren cracks a small smile, his mind calming at the thought of Thomas coming home in Edward's intimate company.
Okay, but if it doesn't get any better by morning, I am going to the hospital to get some ointment.
Warren says, breaking free from Edward as he feels the profound burn in his arms spiking. He leaves his breakfast half-eaten and heads back into the halls of the house, meandering until he gets to the library. The lights still flickered occasionally, but it wasn't so cold and musty since Edward had gotten the heating system back up and running. He runs a burning hand down the bookshelves and pulls out a dusty copy of Catcher in the Rye and flops down on the faded leather couch in the middle of the room. He opens it, hoping that he could distract himself from the pain, but 2 pages in and he was scratching his skin raw, leaving long, raking, glistening lines in his skin. He worries about the rash spreading and throws the book down with nothing retained and runs back out of his room, rushing into the bathroom to wash his hands again. The cold water searing his flesh. As he turns the water off and gingerly pats at his rash, he hears someone in his room.
Warren, dear, I have something here you might ease the pain with.
Lila calls down the small closet hallway into the room. She stands in the doorway, half hidden behind the frame.
Okay, you can come in if you want. I'm just trying to clean up the best I can.
Warren calls behind his back. He doesn't hear her say anything. He turns to look at her, where she stands meekly askew now out of the door.
I'd feel more comfortable out here. It's just too personal for me to be in your washroom,
she says. Warren, mildly annoyed, tosses the towel aside and heads back up to his room, freezing as he turns back to shut the door. As it closes, he catches a glimpse of Lila's reflection just before the door clicks shut. He could swear he saw her with glowing red eyes and a bald, peeling scalp. Her face was disfigured and her hands clasped at her waist had been inhuman, long and gangly with what looked like hooks at her fingertips. In a split-second move, he pushes the door back open to confirm what he saw, but she looked back at him purely, if not puzzled by his scared expression in the mirror. He shuts the door again and approaches her slowly, unsure of what he had seen.
What's wrong, Warren?
She asks, and he shakes his head knowing that he couldn't share what he thought he saw without making her think he was insane. She gestures for him to sit on the bed, and he does. She comes over with a bowl of thick paste. It smells acrid and is bubbling.
What is that, Lila?
Warren questions. She smiles as she scoops up some in her bare hand and smooths it over his skin.
It's just some vinegar, baking soda, a bit of witch hazel, and a couple of secret ingredients. It's something I learned long ago.
She says, and it burns for a second and Warren tenses, but quickly the salve soothes the itching and pain. He lets out a sigh of relief and Lila smiles at him, covering all of his irritated skin. As he leans back, no longer ready to claw his skin off, she wraps several damp cloths over his arms and leaves just as Edward opens the door. She shoots her son a knowing look as they pass that Warren doesn't notice. The door clicks shut and Edward leans down over Warren as the man finishes tucking the fabric around his arm.
Told you.
Edward gloats, kissing Warren's forehead and flopping down on the bed behind him, leaning on one hand. Warren smiles, turning and running a hand down Edward's chest.
Yeah, I know. Now, what is the mission for today? Siding or tracking down these electrical issues?
Warren asks. Edward scoffs and pulls Warren's hand to his mouth, kissing the knuckles that peeked from the wrapping.
Your mission is to keep your rash from getting any worse by sweating and moving around,
Edward says, and Warren groans, falling back and letting his head rest on Edward's hard-bowed stomach.
I don't want to lay around all day.
Warren complains, and he feels Edward laugh. Warren turns his head to look over at Edward's legs, and after a few moments of his large hands toying with his hair, happy to close his eyes as long as Edward wasn't moving on with the day without him. But he sees that Edward's starched, faded jeans were tenting, the pitch increasing with each moment. Warren scoffs and turns to look at Edward.
Really?
Warren says, and Edward shrugs. Warren reaches down, fumbling with the zipper, his hands almost useless in the dressing. Just before he can free Edward's growing erection, the hand leaves his head and grabs his wrist gently. Warren looks up to his lover again, and the man slowly shakes his head.
I told you, no sweating or moving around,
he says, leaning up and scooping Warren under the arms before sliding him up to lay back on the pile of pillows. He unbuttons Warren's shorts, smiling as his warm palm wraps around the slider man's shaft. He pumps at Warren, his grin widening as Warren bites his lips, holding in a moan.
Well, what about the no sweating and moving?
Warren asks tightly as he feels the telltale slickness wet Edward's hand.
I said you couldn't,
Edward hums, his mouth down around Warren before anything else can be said. Warren yelps, his bandaged hands wrapping up in the comforter as Edward expertly pleasures him, his hot mouth sending Warren into fits of ecstasy, his mind slowing down as he draws close to an orgasm. Edward quickens, sensing this, and after a few moments Warren is gasping, releasing into his lover's mouth and bending and twisting in his sheets as bright colors flash behind his eyelids. He opens them after a moment and looks down at Edward, who releases him with a taunting, wet smirk on his face, his throat flexing as he makes a show of swallowing.
Fuck,
Warren mutters as Edward stands, stuffing his erection back into his jeans before zipping up and leaving without a word. Warren lays there for a long time as his groin grows cold and wonders at his luck. He'd always had a fantasy world in his mind where he lived in a little cabin with a hulking, hirsute, insatiable lover with a taste for submission. He'd never thought it would be a reality, but as he waddles to the bathroom to clean himself up after a while, pants around his thighs, he laughs, realizing he had stumbled into that world, and it was one that came with a mansion, hired help, and everything he could think of. He wipes himself down before pulling his shoes on, stopping by the kitchen to grab a couple of bottles of soda and a picnic blanket from a hook in the pantry, a pack of cigarettes from the counter, and head outdoors. He traces Edward to the sounds of nails on wood and finds the man, his shirt already in the grass, pounding nails in one swift motion into new, unpainted clapboard.
Didn't think you could get rid of me that easy, did you?
He asks, and Edward laughs, wiping his sweating brow.
What did I say about sweating and moving? Edward asks.
Who said anything about that?
Warren asks back, flaring the blanket out in the shade, sitting down and cracking the seal on his bottle. Edward chuckles and goes back to his work. Warren lays back the soft grass under the blanket, rustling as he settles in, satisfied to lay back and watch the man. The rhythmic pounding, the soft grunting, and creeping sunlight on his body quickly has Warren napping on the grass. When his body crosses that threshold, his mind wakes up. As he recalls what he forgot during the day, he peeks up to Edward. The glistening, straining muscles of his arms and back are no longer simply attractive, but now threatening as well. Warren stands, walking slowly towards Edward, who doesn't notice him. Warren, sure he wouldn't be followed, walks casually towards the woods, afraid that too much movement or noise could alert his companion. He doesn't make a sound as he creeps through the woods towards his rendezvous spot, hoping to catch Thomas. Of course, when he arrived, the place looked as abandoned as the crude campsite could look. Warren, taking a trick from his own book, quickly grabs a twig and crudely scrawls a message in the soil, stamping it firm to make sure Thomas would see it. He looks down at the message.
Let them catch you. W.
He claps his sore hands together, ready to sit and wait for Thomas in case he showed up, but after a short while of quiet peace there in the clearing, Warren can feel the familiar tugging that meant he was waking up. He doesn't bother to move, just lets his consciousness warp back into his body. When his eyes open, he's looking up into Edward's. He smiles dumbly, now enamored with his darling captor. Edward kisses him intimately, his hands sliding up under Warren's head as his body comes alive. Warren, thwarted by his arms, lays there basking in the attention and sunlight.
How long was I out?
Warren asks, as Edward leans up and takes a drink of the other soda.
A while. A couple of hours, I would say.
He answers. Warren was sure he was only asleep a few minutes. He leans up and fishes a cigarette from his pocket. He lights it swiftly, watching the smoke circle up towards the sky. He tilts the soft pack towards Edward, who takes one and lights it between the tips of 2 fingers. Warren giggles, remembering a movie he had watched about a couple of cowboys in love who held their cigarettes that way. He'd always wondered if anyone actually smoked the same.
What?
Smoke slips between Edward's tight, full lips.
You're like every masculine stereotype wrapped into one, except for being a cocksucker.
Warren says, uncharacteristically vulgar. Edward chokes on his inhale, sputtering and laughing.
Who says being a cocksucker isn't masculine?
Edward asks, rolling over to straddle Warren, pinning him against the warm blanket and putting a huge hand across the man's chest. He bears down, gyrating his hips gently, pressing the air from Warren's diaphragm.
Point taken.
Warren whispers, giggling as Edward leans down and presses his lips to his bows.
To answer your question, some people present one side during the day and another when the lights go out.
Edward growls into the space next to Warren's ear. Warren shivers at his intonation. He could lay like that all day, but Edward hops back to his feet, returning to his chores as Warren smokes leisurely, watching Edward and chatting with him until the sun dips behind the peak of the roof, which signals them to head in for dinner. At the table, the conversation is light and pleasant, much as Warren was used to, until he brought up Thomas, asking what time he would be back the next day.
Yes, Edward, when is your brother supposed to be home?
Lila asks pointedly. Edward looks at her with irritation.
They said it may be tomorrow evening or the morning if he's ready. I won't know until they call,
he says in a low voice.
Good. Hopefully they can find the means to have him ready earlier,
she says, smiling into her glass. Edward grunts in response, and the rest of dinner is largely silent. When Warren retires to his room for the night, Edward follows him meekly.
What are the plans for tonight?
He asks as Warren undresses to his briefs and climbs into his bed, patting the empty side.
My arms are pretty sore. Can we just watch TV tonight?
Warren asks, and Edward agrees, stripping down and shaking the bed as he climbs in. He settles down under the crook of Warren's arm, watching some stupid reality show with Warren as the heavy dinner settles in his stomach. His lids grow heavy in the warm, comfortable embrace, and soon his eyes shut and his dreams begin. Edward is already looking at him when his eyes open again. Warren was already getting better at masking the momentary panic of his memories restoring themselves.
Hey, Sleepy, don't you want to have a little fun before we fall asleep?
Edward suggests, nipping at Warren's bare chest. Warren flinches and Edward looks up at him intensely.
You do want me, don't you, lover?
He asks, beginning to rise up from Warren's arms. Warren kisses him quickly.
Of course, my arms are just too painful, and I don't want to be lazy, Edward. You deserve more than that,
Warren says. Edward shrinks back down into Warren's skin.
That's okay. We have all the time in your world.
Edward says, and Warren, unsure if his ploy would work, begins to tediously let his head slip back, drooping his eyelids slowly, eventually letting his body relax as if he was asleep. He steadies his breathing, waiting, hoping Edward found it believable that he would be asleep inside a waking dream. After what he thought had to have been an hour of laying completely still, Warren feels Edward move and can feel the man's hot breath on his face. He says nothing, and Warren continues to lay there, praying that he was a better actor than he'd been in the 5th grade play. Edward moves eventually, and Warren can hear his feet hit the ground, but as the steps get further away, they grow hollow and sharp like keys on a keyboard. Warren doesn't dare open his eyes, but knows that Edward has morphed. The door clicks closed, and Warren listens, his eyes closed. He knows it could be a trap, and so he rolls over lazily like someone tossing and turning, peeking for a split second at the door. No one was there. He then gets up quickly and looks out the door, and in nothing but his underwear he scurries to the staircase, sneaking all the way up to the 4th floor studio. When he arrives, he gets to the large round window just in time to see Lila and Edward glowing red in their true forms headed into the edge of the forest. Warren hopes desperately that his plan worked, and that his irrational waking brain's guilt at not visiting Thomas had granted him entry into the house and not cost him his life. Warren smiles to himself as he spots the small plume of smoke rising from the canopy. The smile dies as he sees a bright red flash under it, the smoke underlit in a terrifyingly beautiful display. More flashes follow it, and eventually the smoke stops, and a few minutes later the two of them reappear, Thomas's limp form draped across their shoulders. Warren rushes back down the stairs, not wanting to give Edward any ideas by not being in bed. He runs back to the intersection of the hallway where his bedroom door was and the entrance hall and peeks around the corner. The front door clatters open after a moment, and Thomas's body comes hurtling in the front room, sending a table with a vase of flowers spinning away. The man looks once again broken and bruised, but as his head comes to rest facing the hall, a split second before his family follows him, Warren sees him look up, a grateful smile on his face. Warren turns the corner and heads back to his room as the sound of solid, painful punches landing on his friend echo. He crawls into the bed, his arms throbbing and itching. He lays there for a long time listening to the dull sounds of abuse and shouting from the front room until eventually the rumbling starts and Warren closes his eyes, unsure what he would end up seeing in the daylight. Okay, I'm back. I still have these bangs. But let's talk about this chapter. So, I've said it all before. I like this chapter. I like what I write. Do I think it's the best thing in the world? No. But here's something, a new development. Not a new development. I've done this before, but okay, I'm going to lean back from the camera, I think, because I look so greasy. Oh my God. Wait, let me wipe this off. I promise I shower regularly. I'm just a greasy person. That's not really that much better, but here's some things that I like in this chapter. The number one thing that I like about this that I think I'm getting better at and that I kind of am trying to take a note on is that every instance of sexual interaction between whatever characters in whatever story I'm writing, they don't have to be long drawn out things, right? I still am getting the hang of, or not getting the hang of, but keeping this more in the forefront of my writing brain is you don't have to explain everything to the audience. Assume your audience is smart enough to understand what's going on. It's not something that I do on purpose, but to me, a lot of times when I'm writing, I'm like, well, I have to spell everything out because I'm not that good of a writer, so to combat that, I have to explain everything in explicit detail and cover every detail of it. Otherwise, it's going to be bad and not complete. So I'd rather it be bad and complete than not complete and bad. Hold for plane. That one sounded heavy. Something else I like in this chapter is that it's not so fast-paced. It's one morning and the night. I think that's fun. I think sometimes I get too caught up in we have to cover a bunch of distance or we have to cover no distance at all or it has to be one night or one day. we can't switch between the two so easily unless it's one of those heavy early exposition chapters. There's not a specific format to the story, right? It's not like diary entries, so it doesn't have to follow the same format every chapter. In fact, I would argue it shouldn't. And so this one, I kind of dropped it right at the end of the night into the next day and then through the next night. And so we kind of will start the cycle again once Thomas is back in. And, once everyone is back together again, that major kind of plot point is over and we don't have to revisit how it happens. We don't have to go step by step as to how it happens, right? Because it wasn't super clear it was probably pretty obvious, but it wasn't explicit what Edward was, I'm having a stroke, what Warren was doing when he was rubbing leaves on his arms. To me, it seems pretty obvious, but I was the one writing it, so I don't know if it is. But we still kind of needed to walk through each of those steps just so it made sense. So there wasn't now wait a second, what actually happened? Could it have just been one mentioning of Poison Oak and we move on? Yes. But I do want to say I'm getting better at plot devices, I guess you would call it. The rash. So the rash seems like a stupid thing. Like, oh, it's a rash. Who cares? But the sleeping, so awake, like the Warren that is fully aware of what's going on, he's doing everything he can to delay his kind of daytime self from giving it up to Edward, because he doesn't, it's pretty clear he doesn't want to give Edward the idea that he can then continue that behavior on into the evening as much as he might want to or not want to. We're not really sure. You can be attracted to someone and scared to them at the same time. You can, especially when they're a giant man. I'm looking up, like, he's up there. He's not. But this new thing that I just introduce and finish out within a couple of chapters, like this plot device, all it does is it's introduced to slow down, like perpetuate Warren's idea of what's going on, because it gets boring for him to just keep denying Edward Congress in his dreams, because it doesn't really make sense. So he's kind of thinking of ways to delay that, right? And as a reader or someone consuming this story, you're like, well, he can't just keep saying it over and over. He's literally dealing with demons. Like, he can't just say, I'm feeling sleepy tonight, right? Like, you can only play the shy, coy, hard to get thing so many times when your day self is sucking dick. If sucking dick was a drug, can't repeat that lyric. When your day self is sucking dick. So he's kind of slowed that down, given himself a new excuse that will further help him in avoiding starting the cycle of like sexually interacting with Edward within his dreams. Is that going to become complicated when the rash heals, because we're assuming the story doesn't just stop within a week or two? Yes. Do I already have ideas as to how we're going to get away with that? And by get away with that, I mean how we can continue with those sorts of things, continue with some sort of sexual things without it being an issue? Yes, but that's still to come. Haha. Also, I have to balance that with the idea that I'm just going to come out and say it. It's what I'm writing, I call it a gay take on a Harlequin romance novel, but realistically what I'm writing is basically smut. It's like fan fiction, like dirty fan fiction, but without the characters being well developed, well known, or well loved, right? Basically, I'm just writing smut, which there's nothing wrong with it. We all love smut. If you're here, you love smut. But what comes with smut is the idea that when there's no factor that's limiting the sexual interactions between two characters, you kind of want to experience it all with them. And by that, I mean not just blowing each other. That's, it's boring. It's boring. So as a reader, as a writer and a reader, you want to explore all of those things with the characters. Like, you want to read those things, whether it's to like further the plot or if it's to get your mind rolling or get something else rolling. We still have to explore all those things. So I already have plans for the next few chapters that will kind of get us to a point where we can still explore the acts of like penetrative sex between two characters, and different kinds of, I say different kinds, different acts, different views, different, switching the positions, 34-35 type of things that we can still explore, but we explore them during the day with Warren and Edward, so that number one, it seems pretty consensual, pretty agreed upon, which Warren's never said outright that he wouldn't have sex with Edward, even knowing that he's a demon. But that we can also explore those without accidentally ruining the entire point of him not having sex with Warren, right? And the story will start to draw to a close quickly, not quickly, but sooner now, because what has started cannot be undone. We all know this. It's very difficult to slow down that train once it's rolling. So, it's not like it's going to be another 6 months or a year that this story will continue, right? We've already had a few months with the characters. It doesn't have to take forever. And we can still get everything we want to explore while not completely destroying the plot line, which is like something that I worry about every time I write something. I'm like, I need to go back. I need to reference what I've written before, make sure I'm not screwing things up. You know what I mean? With that said, I would also like to take a moment to kind of think about some of the things that we're going to have to address. So I guess if you don't want any spoilers, like, they're not going to be spoilers, but you just skip to next week whenever it gets posted, which will be, of course, on Wednesday, like it is. Well, it's probably like Thursday by the time you first see it, or depending on where you are. But so we assume we haven't been specifically instructed or told how demon procreation works, right? We know that the demons have sex with the humans, they make baby. We get that, but it's not really clear how similar it is to, human on human interaction. I'm going to be honest with you. I toyed around with this idea for a little while, and I thought maybe I could do it. But number one, I'm not a good enough writer. Number two, it's not really my experience. And number three, I think it kind of verges on, I think it would kind of verge on being a little bit triggering or problematic, or just kind of alienating. My first inclination was to, again, not going to do it. This is not how it's going to work. But this was my first thought, was to, make it so that when Edward and Warren interact, that Edward would end up with, a uterus. You could call it a deuterus if you wanted to, up in his body. And so then technically he could gestate a pregnancy. While I find the idea of that interesting, I do think that could be very alienating and not disheartening, or it could. It's not something I would feel comfortable speaking for or about or referencing. Not afraid to reference. Just not something I think I could do. Just because there are people who experience the world in maybe on one side of the gender spectrum, or closer to one side of the gender spectrum, but their internal physiology, their internal working systems do not coincide with what it is that they present and how they act and how they, have sex in the real world. So I think it teeters too close to me being a cis white passing gay person trying to speak for an experience that I should not speak for, right? So X-nay on that idea. So then my second idea was like, what if Edward just kind of does a bibbity boppity boo Cinderella's godmother thing and just spins around and ta-da, he's transformed into somebody with a uterus. Maybe it's a physical transformation on the outside that's very different from what he's been presenting. That also felt very similar to kind of the other way that I was feeling about the idea of like internal versus external. Very valid. All of those are very valid experiences, but they're not my experience, and they're not close enough to my experience that I feel like I can relate to them or speak for them or on them or about them really, which also I do sometimes question the line of like, as a person who writes, I'll just call myself a person who writes, or in the same way as like people who make movies, right? People who make movies or who write books don't just write books and characters and create movies with only people. Well, a lot of times they do just create those things for people who look exactly like them and represent their storyline. We don't like that, right? We love diversity. We love, inclusion, of course. But we love it when the power and inclusion, let's spell it out, when that isn't in the hands of a cis straight white man. It's not always necessary, right? It's not always necessary that a man or a cis person or a straight person or a white person has that power, right? When the person telling the story is making the decisions on casting or is making the decisions on the characters in a book, it's better for the person who's doing it to kind of write for that experience. I can write pretty easily the experiences of cisgender people because I'm cis. Hi, I'm cis. Right, like I can write from the experiences of being cisgender. That's not something I've ever really had qualms about writing for. In the same way that I don't have a huge issue with like creating female characters, creating feminine characters. It's one of those things where I'm not really that great at making them as nuanced and complicated, but that's also because I don't want to overstep my boundaries. And sometimes I feel like maybe I worry too much about overstepping my boundaries to the point where I won't say do myself a disservice, but I worry so much that it ends up affecting what I'm writing where nobody is even going to care, right? But nobody's going to care anyway. But for me, right, I don't want to write something that is going to make things worse for somebody. So then my third, and I think the final and kind of best way, not me looking at myself in the camera and I've got crazy eyes, I think the best way for me to kind of go forward in this whole pregnancy, gestating a demon thing is we're going to address how exactly it happens, but I'm pretty sure it's going to happen like it does with penis to vagina. I think that's still the only way. Not even penis to vagina. Sperm to egg cell. It's going to be very similar to what we're used to. But I do think we're going to venture into the world of uncomfy for that. If we do end up getting to that point. So that's why I'm kind of keen on the idea of pursuing all of the sexual acts that we can get out of Edward and Warren, anybody else, pursuing all of that and experiencing that as the reader and the writer. And then once we've experienced all that in a fun, consensual, enjoyable way for Warren and for Edward, it would seem, he seems like he's enjoying himself. Then we can explore the same experience, but in his dream cycle. Hold for plane. That one sounds like it's just carrying iPhones. So experiencing that same sort of sexual interaction, basically what I'm talking about is penetrative sex, experiencing that in his dream cycle where somebody else is going to end up being introduced to kind of complete that action, if that makes sense. Is it going to be gross? Maybe. Am I going to change my mind in the future? Yeah, maybe. Am I definitely not going to purposely try and write anything that alienates people or like speaks for experiences that I have no business speaking for? Yes, I am going to try and avoid that the best that I can, because it just seems like a good idea, and also seems like a good way for me to keep kind of educating myself and looking for where that line is. And while I'm looking for the line and not crossing it, and like making a point not to cross it, maybe educating myself so that the line moves one way or the other. Hopefully I just never cross it wherever it ends up in its final form. But that's what I like about this chapter. I think it's fun. I think it's funky. I think it's unusual. It's very nice. And I think that you caught my reference to Brokeback Mountain. And I'd just like to say I watched Brokeback Mountain, did cry profusely again, like I do every time that I watch it. And do you notice, like, when I smoke a cigarette, and I do smoke a cigarette, I smoke it holding it like this. Is it because I'm gay? Maybe. But I see lots of people hold it like that. Or, like, straight guys will just kind of, like, hold it, and, like, old men will just kind of, like, hold it in front of their mouth like that. But I don't want wrinkles. So I'd rather have the lung cancer, no wrinkles. But I was watching Brokeback Mountain, and they were, of course, smoking. It was set in the 60s and 70s. So they're smoking, and they're holding their cigarettes like this, kind of like you hold an herbal cigarette. And I find that so interesting, because that little twist of, instead of doing this and holding it between your two fingers, which is something that I know it's problematic, but I do kind of associate with the more elegant, more feminine, more put together way. This idea of like holding your cigarette like and like pinching your lip is so quintessentially masculine, because it makes no sense. It's more effort. It is grosser and less sanitary and just like all around gruffer. I find it very masculine and very sexy. So I did throw that in here. But next week is going to be a fun one, because we will have the return of Thomas to the house. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be fun, funky, fresh. And we're going to address a major question that I've kind of had for myself to figure out how to deal with it. And that question for next week is, how is it that during the day Thomas hasn't just come to Warren and said, here's what's going on, here's what you need to do, and here's how we get out of this. You need to wake up. Like, you need to figure this out. How is it that has not happened yet? Because it's had to have occurred to you as the listener. Why hasn't Thomas just said something? Why hasn't Thomas just told Warren, you have to get out, they're dangerous, this, that, told him that they're murderers, whatever? So we're going to kind of address that next week. And I think Thomas is going to have some pretty good answers that will hopefully fill that plot hole. And, this is a rough draft, so maybe in a final draft, it's not in chapter 18. It moves back to chapter 13 or 14 when Warren is first figuring out what's going on. But I will not continue talking. I do have to edit all of this, which I hope you have enjoyed me editing it a lot more, and like taking each of the characters, giving them their own separate sound, and lowering the voices of some of the characters, not to like a creepy level, because I will admit that when in the last chapter, when I had to lower my own voice to make Thomas's demon voice, because it was like lower than his regular voice, I did find it kind of sexy. But it's between you and me. I hope you've enjoyed that. It probably adds a couple hours onto editing, but I do think that it breaks things up, and just the interruption of background sound kind of helps to cut it out a little bit, and it helps to give you the feeling almost that you're listening to like an old school radio play, if that makes sense, because that's kind of what I'm trying to elicit, but like make it gay, make it sexy. If you never listened to a radio play before, I used to listen to them with my grandfather when I was a kid. He had all these cassette tapes, and he bought them when like CDs were fully a thing. Like I had an iPod, but he bought these cassette tapes that were old, like 1940s radio drama. So before television was something that was in everyone's living room, bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, pocket, butt. Before TVs were everywhere, they had radio dramas, which were just, it's like this. It's an audio formatted drama, and of course I have the video version, but it's just so that if you do everything on YouTube, you can access it. And so that I have an excuse to fix my hair. But that's kind of, I'm realizing that's what I'm leaning into. I know it's not an audiobook because I'm giving you the preview beforehand, and then afterwards I'm talking to you for 15, 20, 30 minutes about what I do or don't like, and kind of just to give myself a reference point for the next week, because I do watch these back when I edit them, when I refresh myself on what I'm doing. I watch back my own comments on what I've written so that I know, like, here's what you should keep an eye out for, here's what you should try and do better, which I think is the best idea. It's why I'm doing this, right? It's kind of like keeping a really hard to edit and consuming diary that helps me better myself as a writer. I also feel like between doing all this, I'm getting like 10 plus hours of writing in a week at least, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you are writing 10 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, Alexa, what's 52 times 10 times...
The answer to your calculation is 520.
That was so easy, and I don't understand why I just did that. Alexa, what is 10,000 divided by 520?
10,000 divided by 520 is approximately 19.2308.
That means technically to master my craft, I only need 19.3 years if I write it 10 hours per week. God, that's a long time. But I've been writing since I was 16, so I only have like 9 more years to go. So I'm doing this for me. I'm doing this for me. And that's okay. But I have to go edit this, and I have to, I've been jump roping for exercise because my depression medication has caused me to gain weight somehow, even though I'm eating less than before. And now I have to go on a new medication. So hopefully Abilify works better for me than Seroquel. But I got to go do jump roping and stuff. So we got to get this done. As always, I appreciate you watching or listening or however you're consuming this content. If you want to give it a like, give it a rating on the little whatever interface you use to get your podcast. It would be great if you told a queer friend of yours. Hi, I'd like to talk to more queers, please. Actually, mostly just queer people. Hi, I want to talk to you. That'd be nice. Tell somebody about it. You know, maybe I could be your dirty little secret. If you're gay out there, I could be your dirty secret with your friends. Do y'all have dirty secrets with your friends? I have dirty secrets with my friends, but that's not important. Anyway, if you want to do those things, it would be much appreciated. Also, shout out to the one person who sponsors me through the app that I use to make this, which is called Anchor. And somebody really, and it means like a lot, is that somebody decided, I'm going to throw some money this idiot's way every month. And I appreciate that. So, as always, hi, Black Lives Matter, Black Trans Lives Matter. Also, right now, we're focusing on, like, Texas, because, like, people are underwater, but also it's sunny there. But also, apparently, your dumbass governor, no offense to Texans, but also, like, a little bit of offense, your dumbass governor is lifting the mask mandate. Y'all are going to need help, okay? Because I recently was in Tennessee trying to be socially distant, and motherfuckers in Tennessee do not want to socially distance, but that's what happens when you have a Republican governor. Anyway, I'll talk to you all next week. Much love. Blah, blah. Just click the button. Bye.